Our distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, good morning from Belgrade and good afternoon in Indonesia. We're very happy that you are here with us this morning to have a discussion on the 60 years of the non-aligned movement, the past, the present, and the future. Now, to begin this discussion, I would like to invite the rector of the University of Belgrade, Professor Dr. Vladan Jokic, to deliver his remarks. Please, sir.
Your Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, dear professors and students, it is my pleasure to say hello on behalf of the University of Belgrade and also for the participants in Indonesia who are online on this seminar. As you know, we are aware that Belgrade is these days the center of the memory of the non-aligned movement, which started 60 years ago. And the two countries, Indonesia and Serbia, which is the, let's say, subsidiary of the former Yugoslavia, were among the 5 main key countries who established this movement. And now in a little different positions, because the Indonesia is still the member country, the Serbia is now the observer country, but still in the memory of this very important moment for the world. In past 60 years, the non-aligned movement had a very important role in the establishment, the peace, the equality of the nations, and it was one of the main and key factors of the stability in the past years. I would like to express my great thanks to Indonesian partners, especially for the ambassador. A few days ago, we signed the agreement of understanding between the University of Belgrade and one of the leading universities in Indonesia, University of Pajajaran, which is a very important school. And this memorandum of understanding is mainly dealing with the economy, with the rise of small and medium enterprises in Indonesia and Serbia, which are going to be organized in a couple of incubators on the faculties of our two countries. Also, this event, which is on the margins of the summit, is very important, and it's a good opportunity to share experiences between two countries regarding the movement, the past of the movement, the current status of the movement, and of course, the future of the movement, what is going to be expected of the countries in the movement in the future. So I would like to thank you once again and to welcome you once again and to have you a very nice and very open discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor. Now, to open this discussion, allow me to invite Ambassador Muhammad Chandra Widyayuda to open this public discussion. Please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Ari, Professor Jokic, dear professors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and I also like to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador Diyar Nur Bintoro, the Executive Secretary of the NAM Center in Jakarta. Let me begin by saying, Poštovane dame I gospodo, pred svega želim da vam se zahvalim na vašem prisustvu I odvojenom vremenu na današnjem nama važnom događaju. So first and foremost, of course, I'd like to thank the Rector, Professor Vladan Jokic, for organizing and collaborating with the Embassy of Indonesia in Belgrade in organizing this public discussion on the non-aligned movement, the past, the present, and the future. As we all know, the last few days, there was a huge gathering, an important gathering, and I must congratulate the government and people of Serbia for successfully convening this commemorative meeting, the 60th anniversary of the first NAM summit, September 1961, held in Belgrade. It was a success, not only for Serbia, but also for the NAM as I mentioned earlier by Professor Jokic, that although Indonesia and Serbia back then Yugoslavia were different in the position. We are the member, and Serbia now is the observer of NAM. But we were together in working together in collaborating to make to make sure that the NAM, the movement, is still relevant and responsive to the global challenges. The professor also mentioned about the archive of the NAM movement, the first NAM summit in Belgrade. And I'm happy to share with colleagues here, with Professor and all dear participants, that during the commemorative meeting, the Foreign Minister of Indonesia, as a special envoy of the President, has announced our proposal, Indonesia's proposal, to nominate the archive of the first NAM summit in Belgrade in 1961 to the International Registry for the memory of the world of the UNESCO. Our respective national archive institutions have been teaming up, on this initiative for quite some time. So we are now united with this common endeavor. So this public discussion today is timely, because not only that we just celebrated the 60th anniversary of the establishment of the NAM, but also to celebrate the growing relations between our two countries. So we have, of course, the distinguished speakers and later on moderator from this important university, which of Belgrade, together join with our colleague from Indonesia, Dr. Yayan Ganda Hayat Mulyana. He's now the head of a training education center of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And of course, colleagues from Indonesia and Serbia, which I know are looking forward to our discussion. Once again, I thank Professor, Rector of University of Belgrade, and all colleagues for presence here. And also, most importantly, is our distinguished speakers, moderator, and participants from Indonesia, from Serbia, and I'm sure some of them are also from other countries who are now joining us online. Once again, thank you very much, and have a fruitful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. Now, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, allow me to invite the moderator and our notable speakers to the floor. And I would like to kindly also...
Yeah, we take turn, eh? Now it's time for us to take the seat over there. Thank you.
At the
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your Excellencies, distinguished Mr. Rector, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished panelists and speakers, it is my huge pleasure and honor to be the moderator of today's discussion, 6 years of the non-aligned movement, the past, the present, and the future. And it's my huge privilege as well to announce today's panelists. Firstly, Ambassador Diar Nurbintoro, Executive Secretary of the Non-Aligned Movement Center for South-South Technical Cooperation. It's a pleasure to have you here with us today. Then Dr. Yayan G.H. Mulyana, who will be present virtually, and he is present virtually currently. So Dr. Mulyana, it is a great pleasure to have you with us today. He's head of the Center for Education and Training of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Indonesia. And our third speaker today is Dr. Marko Kovačević, my colleague from the University of Belgrade Faculty of Political Sciences, where he works as a teaching assistant. So without further ado, I don't want to waste your time for the fruitful discussion, which we are all waiting for. But I will just briefly kindly ask all of the panelists, since we do not have too much time, and I suppose there will be a lot of questions as well from the audience, if they can stick in their answers to 5 to 7 minutes, something like that, so we can have enough time for all of the questions and for the questions from the audience. So to start with the past, since our today's debate is about the past, present, and the future, so it seems to be logical to start with the past. And when we discuss the past, and the history of the non-aligned movement, Belgrade plays important role in its history. And having in mind this importance of the origin and establishment of the non-aligned movement, my first question for my colleague Marko Kovačević would be, since there are some, well, I don't want to call them disputes, but let's say debates in literature about what is the authentic date and place of foundation of the non-aligned movement. Is the cradle of the non-aligned movement the Belgrade Conference in 1961 as we consider it today, or do you have a different attitude towards this question? Marko, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Milan. Good afternoon, Honorable Mr. Rector, Your Excellencies, dear colleagues, dear guests. We are here today to remember the 60th anniversary of the Belgrade Conference of the Non-Aligned Movement from September 1961. But I would like to start here by delineating certain processes that actually led to the conference and actually how the non-aligned movement emerged in 1961. I would like to point to that the non-alignment can be considered both an idea and a reality. And that kind of reality emerged from a very complex set of contexts, which were the context of the end of the Second World War, the context of decolonization, the context of the emerging Cold War in the end of the 1940s and early 1950s, as well as the concrete efforts by the countries that were actually giving birth to the non-aligned movement in 1961. And it is convenient to say that this ideational development of the non-aligned movement can, according to some authors, be traced back even to 1927, to some conferences that actually were preceding the actual birth of the institutionalized and conference-like form of non-alignment. Also, some important dates would include the conference in 1947 that happened in New Delhi, as well as the conferences that were coming afterwards. For example, a very important and momentous moment was the conference in Bandung, which was the conference of Asian and African countries in 1955. And then comes the specific context of the Cold War, the specific issues and policies. Then important moment was the conference or summit in Briuni in 1956, when the leaders of Yugoslavia, Egypt, and India gathered to give some kind of more formalized attitude towards what will become a non-aligned movement. But that was not the end. A very important moment was the conference in New York in 1960 that was on the margins of the General Assembly, when the so-called the 5 leaders of the movement got together to bring to the world the attention that 23 countries that were actually becoming independent and decolonized in the 1950s and the 1960s became members of the United Nations. So that was a very important effort. And then we come to 1961. And 1961 was actually a very important year for international relations, for international security and world politics more generally, because that was the context of Cold War confrontation between the 2 superpowers and the beginning of certain crises when it comes to nuclear competition between the 2 superpowers, as well as giving rise to the emergence of the Berlin Wall in 1961. So that was a very complex context. And then we have to mention that there was the conference in Cairo in June 1961 that was on the ministerial and preparatory level, actually an attempt to organize the process that was supposed to lead to something next. And then actually Belgrade Conference actually emerged as a peak of those attempts, but that there was also some kind of diplomatic, I would say, competition around which city will be the leader of this conference. And then Belgrade emerged. I read that actually Budimir Lončar, who was one of the members of this conference in 1961, said that there was certain competition between Cairo and even Cuba, Havana. But then with the help from our Indonesian friends, I think that has to be acknowledged by their help, the conference happened to be in Belgrade with other diplomatic efforts by Budimir Lončar and Yugoslav diplomats. So I think a further historical research has to be done in order to see what was the diplomatic process, and maybe Lončar's memoirs can be one way to see that kind of development. So in order to answer to this question, non-aligned movement formally was born in Belgrade conference, but the process is much longer. And that was the combination between the regional conception of non-alignment and the global conception of non-alignment. And here I would like to point to the differences in this concept of non-alignment between our Indonesian friends and President Sukarno, who actually visited, I think, Belgrade 5 times in the 1950s and 1960s, and President Tito visited Indonesia twice in that period of around 15 to 20 years, from the early 50s to the, let's say, late 60s and 1970s. So those bilateral relations were very much important in the birth of non-alignment, and there were several leading countries. But in this formal sense, the concept of non-alignment got to this global level. And with this cooperation between, let's say, 5 or 6 leading nations of non-alignment, and with Yugoslavia being this formal diplomatic embodiment of that birth of non-alignment, the movement actually started, was born in Belgrade in 1961. But we have to acknowledge this ideational, this bilateral, multilateral cooperation of small state and middle power multilateralism of those new states. And in this sense, maybe I would like to conclude in this introductory note that there was this quote by this scholar called Ajami, Fuad Ajami, who in 1980, 1981 wrote this article in Foreign Affairs Journal saying that the men who met in Bandung were dreamers. Yugoslavia was an observer in Bandung, actually, but because that was the conference of Asian and African states. But Yugoslavia, in its geopolitical adversary context of the Cold War politics in Europe, decided to reach out to the world to look for this third way, and that third way was built by all these countries together in the non-aligned movement.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kovačević, for this really interesting journey through the early history of the non-aligned movement. And we are continuing with the debate about the past, but we are also transferring to the more recent past and to the today's work of the non-aligned movement. And therefore, I would kindly ask Ambassador Dear Nurbintoro to tell us a bit more about the non-aligned movement Center for South-South and Technical Cooperation, which was established in 1995. So according to the mandate, actually, which was gave at the Cartagena conference at the 11th Non-Aligned Movement Summit in 1995. So Your Excellency, what role has the center played to help the non-aligned movement countries to develop both economically and socially so far? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Milan, Pristik, the moderator. Your Honorable, Professor Dr. Ferdinand Jovic, Rector of University of Belgrade, Your Excellency, Ambassador Muhammad Chandra, Indonesian Ambassador for Serbia. I understand that also with us, Ambassador of Egypt, His Excellency Mr. Amar Alawili. Your Excellency, distinguished panelists, Mr. Dr. Yayan Mulyana in Jakarta, Dr. Marco Krupcik. Good morning in Belgrade, good afternoon in Jakarta. I would like to give a picture of CSSTC, which already been said by Dr. Milan Pristik, which the center has been established on 11
NAM summit in Cartagena, prepared by Indonesia and Brunei Darussalam at that time. So NAM CSSTC is always synergizing, in particular informing a vision using the result of the 11th NAM summit in Cartagena, vision of NAM CSSTC, strengthening developing countries' collective capacity and self-reliance. So this public discussion is related to what have been done by NAM CSSTC, the present and the future. So by that theme of this public discussion, NAM CSSTC would like to more do better to work for understanding of the South-South cooperation and implementing a sustainable and applicable program activity for the developing countries. This is the way NAM CSSTC have to be done. NAM CSSTC also aim to considerably strengthen the program activities directly linked to the strategy and vision of the organization, and also by the 11th NAM Summit outcome of culture. The NAM CSSTC hope to apply a range of tactics in order to achieve organization objective. NAM CSSTC organized activities throughout the COVID-19 pandemic at least one time a month, particularly in 2021. NAM CSSTC has partnered with the ministries in Indonesia and institutions in other countries to identify participants as representatives from member countries and the teams based on developing countries' needs. The existence of partners with cooperative advantage in identifying worldwide specialists to speak for the work of the South-South cooperation. Instrument for evaluation to be careful measure to precisely identify marks for the success of activities, and also partners to coordinate the joint objective of the South-South cooperation, closely flexibility, and commit to completing them. This is the aim of the NAM CSSTC. The recent training activities focus on the sharing of hydroponic expertise throughout Indonesia and a number of African, Latin American, Caribbean countries, and on exchange of knowledge of plant and horticultural farming practices in their respective countries. In the past, we had workshop on IUU fishing and energy and transport conference. In the pandemic, implementation of activities not only increases non-CSSTC portfolio as South-South cooperation facilitator, but also allow non-CSSTC the chance to address the requirement of member countries in the midst of barrier to the pandemic. NAM-CSSTC works with people from other countries who share the same enthusiasm for agriculture, fisheries, and energy. We also noticed that collaboration on science and technology progress between countries with small gaps is far more effective than between countries with huge gaps because of the case for the ease with which technology is introduced from one country to another. While NAM comprises of less developed and developing nations, many of its members countries, including Indonesia, are now emerging economies with increasing influence in the global stage, both economically and politically. How will this emerging economy shape the future of NAM? Since over 6 decades, there has been a strong interest among various NAM members countries, particularly the emerging economy today. We note that this excitement depends on the enthusiasm and commitment to multilateral and solidarity rather than on the economic situation of member countries. Indonesia, for example, in the early years following the independence of the Republic of Indonesia, Sukarno led the NAM during the Cold War. Until 1995, Indonesia became the icon of major economic progress and wealth in Southeast Asia.
It represents Indonesia's unwavering effort to preserve and enhance North-South collaboration and discussion. Notwithstanding the nation's goal, its leadership or presidency of NAM always show the same enthusiasm and vision as to how it wants to shape NAM. When international relations are defined as power, particularly when there is a power imbalance between developing and developed countries. As a movement free from the power disparities, NAM remains worldwide relevant and continues to raise a new voice for all. Are there challenges that occurred to the disruptor with the world is facing today? In the implementation of South-South cooperation among NAM member countries? And how does NAM CSSTC as an institution that organizes South-South technical cooperation for NAM countries respond in those challenges? NAM CSSTC has adapted rapidly in program since 2020 by transforming physical activity into virtual operation. It goes without saying that not all developing countries those participate at consistent internet speed in video conferencing in times of pandemic conditions that force remote activities. This is a tremendous technical challenge, but extremely important. In the meantime, they need very important technology support in order to meet Industrial Revolution 4.0. NAM CSSTC formulated a strategy to address this difficulty, namely paying attention to the region or continents which allow the NAM CSSTC operation in order that all non-aligned countries can experience NAM CSSTC activities. Second, NAM CSSTC needs to improve the program of activities in the area of IT and in non-aligned countries, in particular, to promote the success of virtual activities. Third, ensuring that the shared technical knowledge during the COVID-19 pandemic is converted to the new habit adaptation condition in such a way that can use without violating physical distance restriction. Of course, the success of this strategy implemented will also depend on solid synergy of program of activity with South-South Cooperation Agency, so that the agency and the NAM CSSTC may fill out one another to strengthen the implementation and expand further. NAM CSSTC benchmarking advantage to be located well and maximally utilized by the participants from various countries. That's short my formation, what and how NAM CSSTC done under the non-aligned movement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and thank you for this great introduction to the work of the Non-Aligned Movement Center for South-South and Technical Cooperation. And I would now kindly ask Dr. Yayan Mulyana to tell us a bit more, especially to the audience here in Belgrade who are interested in this issue. And to be honest, we do not have opportunity to listen about these issues too often. So this might be a good opportunity for us to get additional information about the Indonesian foreign policy and the role of the non-aligned movement in Indonesian foreign policy. So therefore, I would kindly ask you, Dr. Mulyana, to tell us what is the non-aligned movement's position in overall Indonesian foreign policy, and does Indonesia have some sort of specific agenda inside the non-aligned movement with specific goals and instruments? The floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Milan, and thank you very much for having me in this important discussion panel. Let me also use this opportunity to congratulate the government of Serbia on the successful high-level meeting to commemorate the 60th anniversaries of the non-aligned movement. For Indonesia, NAM is and has been and always be a critical element of its foreign policy and diplomacy, the foreign policy that adopts the independent and active principle. Historically, non-aligned movement has become a pivotal forum for Indonesia in its efforts to advocate and achieve not only national interests, but also common interests and to establish a global order based on freedom, lasting peace, and social justice as mandated in the 1945 Constitution preamble. The movement that embodies principles and the Dasar-Sila Bandung, or the 10 principles of Bandung, has always been not only the conceptual, but also the normative sources of Indonesia's foreign policy and the guiding principles in the conduct of Indonesia's foreign policy. And the NAM itself as an organization or as a movement has been placed within the architectures or the foreign policy establishment of Indonesia as a critical element within which that our foreign policy interest has been projected. Yes, it is now we are having more vehicles through which that we can advocate both national and common interest. We have, for example, G20. We have as well APEC. We have as well, of course, G77. And of course, we have United Nations. And we have other fora of international cooperations. But again, as part of the birth, the advance of the movement, and as we have historical ties with the movement, and this history has been capitalized as the core elements of our foreign policy. So we see the non-aligned movement continues to be an extremely important vehicle for Indonesia's foreign policy. Or as Her Excellency Bu Retno said in her statement in Belgrade, that the foundations of the movement is an integral part of Indonesia's history as a nation. And in the complexities of the present international relations and the corrosions of international order caused by rivalries among strategic powers, for example, the rejuvenation and the reinvoking of the Bandung principles is extremely relevant to place, for example, the importance of the equality among all nations, mutual interests and cooperations, and respect for justice. The rejuvenation or the replacements of, or the inclusions of those principles in the efforts to create or to build a new international order that is deemed extremely important in this daunting situation. I believe that the inclusions of these 10 principles of Bandung is of great, is of utmost importance for the international community, especially for the non-aligned movement nations or the non-aligned movement member countries. And as far as the specific agenda that Indonesia places great importance within the non-aligned movement, of course, one of them, as Her Excellency also said in her statement in Belgrade on the struggle of Palestine for justice in accordance with the Bandung Principle. And we recall that of the 29 countries that attended the 1955 Bandung Conference, only Palestine has yet to become independent. And it has been too long and long overdue for seeing an independent state of Palestine. And this is a critical agenda that Indonesia would always advocate within the context of the non-aligned movement. And of course, Indonesia has always been a traditional custodian in the areas of disarmament and non-proliferation. And for many decades, we chaired the working group on disarmament and non-proliferations. But at the same time as well, we are concerned that as we are embracing greater international cooperations, both within non-aligned movement as well as outside the non-aligned movement, that we are seeing growing situations that requires close attentions from the movement in the areas of peace and security. The situation in Afghanistan, for example, the situation in the Middle East, in Syria, in Libya, and in the Korean Peninsula. These are the situations that probably in our view, if I mean, at least at my personal view, that the non-alignment will have to exert its weight, the ability to respond to these situations. That would, of course, make the critical importance of the movement. And of course, beyond the peace and security agenda, Indonesia as well places great importance to, for example, creating an inclusive global health architecture supported by inclusive governance and also cooperations. That includes equal access to vaccines and vaccine availability for all. And of course, the joint efforts, the concerted efforts in responding to the challenge of the existential challenge of the climate change, as well as the realizations of the sustainable development goals. And this is probably, and of course, a green and blue economy, as Indonesia, an archipelagic country that would also see in what ways that in the agendas of development and economic cooperations that we can advocate the interests of NAM countries, the common interests of NAM countries to promote the common goods of green and blue economy. So again, if I may conclude that the non-alignment movement is and has been and will always be at the core of the Indonesian foreign policy, and it will always be the critical vehicle for Indonesia's diplomacy and in shaping the global governance and the global order that benefits all nations. And the Bandung principles and the principles of the NAM that that are embodied by the movement itself will always be the normative guiding principles for Indonesia's diplomacy and foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mulyana, for this great overview of the role which non-aligned values have in Indonesian foreign policy and the connection between Indonesian foreign policy and the non-aligned movement, foreign policy goals and priorities and non-aligned movement today. And I'm Ambassador of Egypt to Serbia, His Excellency Ambassador Amr Al-Jovali has joined us online as well. So I would like to use the opportunity and to kindly ask His Excellency just to share with us his views about the future of the non-aligned movement. Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I would like, first of all, to start by thanking my dear friend and colleague, His Excellency Ambassador Chandra, for the invitation to participate, at least as an observer, to this important meeting. And I'd like to also, of course, commend and highlight the excellent presentations and interventions by the distinguished speakers. I can see already not only the energy that they bring into this important movement, but the valuable thoughts and ideas. So be it from our dear friends and colleagues, distinguished speakers from Indonesia, with whom we've had a long and historical relationship in furthering the principles and the purposes of the NAM, but of course our hosts in Serbia, the University of Belgrade, and all the speakers, who I take this opportunity to extend the warmest congratulations for the success of the Belgrade meeting, especially in these challenging times of COVID. And it really proves that when there is a will, there is a way, and the large participation of the member states during these challenging times, but also the ideas that were shared in the deliberations of that meeting, and of course in the side meetings, are a proof that the non-aligned movement remains as relevant as it could be, and that there is also room for further adjusting and strengthening the movement for its future role. There isn't much to add after the valuable thoughts that have been shared by the speakers. I would only maybe like to highlight a slightly different perspective, which I was happy to elaborate further in a book that was published by the Institute of International Politics and Economics, headquartered in Belgrade, with a number of other thinkers and with a number of other thinkers and intellectuals from, I think, 20 members of the non-aligned movement, which is what I call the working non-aligned movement. We always think of the non-aligned movement at the level, at the highest visible level, which is the heads of states and government, or even the ministers. As important as that is, the non-aligned movement has an incredibly influential and impactful dimension, which is the expert level. I worked, and I had the honor to work both for the Egypt's mission at the United Nations in Geneva and in New York, and particularly in New York, we can see how important the negotiating collective mind, if I can call it such, of the non-aligned movement in areas that are incredibly important for the shaping of the international system, the agenda making of the international relations, and of course the work and activities of the United Nations. In fact, Indonesia plays an incredibly important role in that regard by being the chair of the working group on disarmament, one that has been as active as one could think of, both at the first committee of the General Assembly that is devoted to international, to disarmament and international security, but also within all other similar forums for the discussion of disarmament and non-proliferation, including the review conferences of the NPT, and of course, even when the GA assumed the negotiating role for the Arms Trade Treaty, also the NAM was important in this direction. But there's also the working group on peacekeeping, which is led by Morocco, and which has a most important contribution into all issues related to conflict resolution, so peacekeeping, peace building, and even mediation and other forms of intervention that the United Nations is called for to help resolve conflicts around the world. Now, all this takes place at the level of the diplomats, maybe counselors, or sometimes even really sort of ambassadors, but it doesn't catch the news of global media. But I would argue is not less important, is no less impactful. There is a literature that the non-aligned movement produces every year, or even at shorter intervals, whereby the collective thoughts and ideas of those 120 countries, including probably the observers as well, that helps shape the discourse of multilateral relations, and hence helps design the norms and the rules and other forms of normative framework that governs the work of the United Nations and all other multilateral organizations. This does not catch the attention of the media, but is very, very important and influential. And I see many, young participants in this valuable seminar that I commend both Indonesia and Serbia for concluding and for holding and convening it. And I am sure that this literature, first of all, can be an excellent guide, can be an excellent reference for those young researchers and diplomats for their thinking about the shape and form of the multilateral system and international relations in general. But also, it's not only a one-way direction whereby unidimensional, whereby we tell the young researchers and diplomats what to do. Rather, we also are happy to hear from them. And I think the latest initiative that the non-aligned movement has taken in establishing a network of youth among its member states can also be a very good avenue for receiving back ideas and intellectual contribution from the young generation and from the youth networks that can further energize and enrich the work of the non-aligned movement. So I think the Belgrade meeting was an opportunity to think creatively out of the box for how the eternal, I would say, principles of the non-aligned movement can assume not only a new not necessarily a new form, but new avenues whereby it can influence and shape a better world. We live in a world of multi-stakeholder diplomacy, and that is probably the dimension where the non-aligned movement can further enhance its work. And I'm happy to have actually highlighted a couple of these in that chapter that I'll be happy to share with the organizers of this important and valuable seminar, and looking forward to feedback and comments from all the participants. So congratulations once again, our dear colleagues and friends in Indonesia, particularly Ambassador Chandra, my good friend and colleague, for this initiative, and of course the University of Belgrade and all the academics from Serbia to have convened this event today. Thank you for to speak and share my ideas in that regard.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, and it was great pleasure to have you with us here today. And since we are already in the second phase of our today's discussion, that means that we should be open for Q&A session. Although I have plenty of questions for our panelists, considering that their initial introductory speeches and answers were great, and they inspired me a lot to ask
voice is gone.
First of all, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is KBRI, and I am the Vice Coordinator of Indonesian Student Alliance Organizations for America and Europe region. And I'm also the President of Indonesian Students Associations in Serbia. And I am also an awardee of Awards in Serbia program in 2020. And right now I am majoring international studies at the University of Belgrade, Faculty of Political and Sciences. And therefore I have the questions. Serbia is in the process of joining the European Union, but the integration faces obstacles such as Serbia and Kosovo issue. Therefore, Indonesia does not recognize Kosovo. So my question is that how far is the relevance of non-alignment movement regarding this matter? Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Fabi. And I would just briefly repeat your question, and please just say to who you address the question, to which speaker, please. Okay, thank you very much. I will just briefly repeat the question, considering that I'm not 100% certain that our online panelists can hear you. So the question was actually regarding the Kosovo issue and how the non-aligned movement affects this issue from the Indonesian and from Serbian point of view. And I would just like to say that the question was asked by Fabiaki Putri, and she was one of the best students which I had last year. So yeah, I was her teacher, and she's really brilliant. So and she's from Indonesia and she studies in Serbia, and I'm really proud of her. Thank you very much, Your Excellency.
Thank you, Baby. Actually, this issue, what is you asked, is not my concern to at my position now. It's not my to answer your question. It's good to Ambassador Chandra to answer your question, because at this moment I'm not at the position on our ministry in Indonesia. So maybe Ambassador. Excuse me. Dr. Yaya. Oh, Dr. Yaya maybe also can answer the big question, because it's more political than much I can say. Please, Dr. Yaya.
Dr. Yaya, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for referring it to me. In fact, as His Excellency says, that I'm not either an expert on Kosovo, but if I may say a few words on this point, we probably recall that the non-aligned movement has 120 member countries and 17 observers. So this is really a gigantic movement, and the size could be the power, but the size could be a challenge. The size should be capitalized in order to be a potential for cooperations and for collaboration. And it also entails, it also carries with it the diversity of realities within non-aligned movement member countries and observers. If we look at the present situations, for example, we have Afghanistan as part of the non-aligned movement. We have North Korea as part of the non-aligned movement. And we have Syria as well as part of the non-aligned movement. And of course, we have some countries in Africa part of the non-aligned movement, and of course, the Myanmar as well as part of the non-aligned movement. So, and of course, Serbia is part of the non-aligned movement as observer. So today we are facing such a complexity of realities that the non-aligned movement is facing within the movement itself, and of course outside the movement. And within that context, this is probably here in asking what makes the non-aligned movement relevant in terms of, as we are having strategic challenges, probably as His Excellency Ambassadors of Egypt suggests, is that we need to reflect out of the box. So probably we need to come out with what we see as strategic responses, as a collective strategic responses from the non-aligned movement. And of course, this would be resting upon the strategic leadership the non-aligned movement could present. And at the same time, we are demanded as part of the international community, as a collective entity within the global order, to contribute to the global peace and security. But at the same time, as a within, we are really challenged by those realities that coming up from the movement members and observers. So probably I just would like to see that on that point of view. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muljana. Professor Kovačević, please just shortly give us your answer on this question as well.
Thank you, Milan. I can probably tell more from the perspective of how Serbia's foreign policy and its relationship with non-aligned movement could have certain implications for the bilateral or certain problems with regards to Serbia and Kosovo issue, which is actually a problematic area in policy, actually. So when it comes to the understanding of non-aligned movement and Serbia's foreign policy, Serbia became an observer of non-aligned movement after becoming a member of the UN, after rejoining the UN in 2000. So it rejoined the non-aligned movement as observer in a different status than former Yugoslavia used to be afterwards in 2001. When it comes to the importance of non-aligned movement for Serbia's Kosovo problem, actually, one has to see how Serbia's foreign policy is actually envisaged. Serbia's foreign policy gives, in multilateral terms, the key importance to the United Nations and to the principles of the United Nations Charter. And what is interesting for us here today in the context of this discussion is that the both Bandung principles and later principles of the non-aligned movement, which were codified from Belgrade Conference to Lusaka Conference in 1970 and onwards, actually have certain overlapping notions within the UN Charter, which are actually embodied in the non-aligned principles and vice versa. So those principles are reinforcing. And in that sense, Serbia has its foreign policy and has its diplomacy. And Serbia's diplomacy has to support Serbia's foreign policy goals and objectives. And those goals and objectives are actually preserving of Serbia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. Because Serbia is a member of the United Nations, actually it seeks to protect its national interests and its sovereignty and territorial integrity through the UN framework, within the UN Security Council through the resolution 1244 from 1999 and through the General Assembly, actually. And once we have the UN General Assembly and the Security Council in mind, Serbia uses as a member state the UN framework for its foreign policy goals. And when it comes to the non-aligned movement, there is the G77 group, which is composed of the non-aligned movement member states. And in that sense, there are those overlapping memberships between different multilateral organizations. And in that sense, Serbia, as an observer within the non-aligned movement, of course, seeks diplomatic support for its foreign policy goals. In that sense, we can draw this conclusion that basically Serbia, as an observer within the movement, with a significant legacy of the Yugoslav membership in the movement from the 1961 onwards, and it's one of its leading roles in the movement, actually seeks various ways to support its present policy goals. And in that sense, we can have this discussion, what is the past and what is the present and what is the future. When it comes to the Yugoslav membership in the movement, that was the past, that was the legacy, that is basically the identity. And Serbia now in the present seeks to mobilize certain aspects of that identity to repurpose it to its present foreign policy goals. And in that sense, I think it is quite a reasonable diplomatic strategy to seek support from the non-aligned movement members. And in that sense, as we have heard from the excellencies and from Mr. Mulayana, actually there is this complexity of the problems, and even within the movement there are different stances towards the recognition of Kosovo. Some members of the non-aligned movement, for example, revoked their recognitions of Kosovo. Some of the members actually recognize Kosovo's independence, but that is the reality of international relations. And diplomacy is there to try to affect and influence certain foreign policy decisions on various countries. So Serbia is having its foreign policy strategy in the present, which of course now sees non-aligned movement members and the non-aligned movement as a venue, as a forum within which it can voice its opinions, with which it can maybe leverage on some of its partnerships and so on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kovačević, for your answer. Professor Đuverović, the floor is yours. Okay, yes, I saw that there is one question online as well. So thank you for your suggestion. We will firstly give the floor to Miss Ivana Prazic for her question. Miss Prazic, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Selamat siang, Bapak-Bapak. Nama saya Ivana. Yes, yeah, the point of my introducing myself in Indonesian is that I think that there is a great number of Dharma Siswa scholarship holders that in Serbia that speak Indonesian fluently. So I was wondering if the Faculty of Political Science has any plans in future to establish a Department of Indonesian Studies? That is one of my questions to the panelists from the Faculty of Political Science. And my second question goes to all of you who would be willing to engage with it. Namely, I earned my PhD from the University of Sydney and the Department of Indonesian Studies there. And I was wondering if you were aware of the fact that in Western academic centers, there's this popular image of Indonesia not actually being a member of non-aligned movement, but only kind of after the Bandung conference, you know, like observing the movement from afar, but not actually and actively involving in its policies. So I thought that idea was quite strange, and well, it came from the observers or scholars from the West. But what do you think? Where does that come from? I mean, the idea that Indonesia was just, you know, hosting a Bandung conference and in 1955, and thereafter it only, you know, observed activities of non-aligned movement, but not making it part of its domestic or international politics. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Prazic. Can you just please tell us who are you directing this question to?
Yeah, I said the second one goes to, well, anyone who feels that they, well, probably to Indonesian participants, because maybe they're familiar with this kind of, you know, rhetorics of Indonesia not being part of the non-aligned movement. Yes, thank you.
Thank you very much. Ambassador Nur Bintoro or Dr. Mulyana, who would like to begin firstly with this question? Ambassador?
Okay.
Yes, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Terima kasih Bu Prazik. Well, Indonesia as a host as a EU question of this, why Indonesia to host this conference of summit. In my point of view, at the time, the President Sukarno wanted to minimize or to put country to be independent. This is the main idea of the President Sukarno. Why Indonesia then host this non-aligned movement? That is my point of view. Maybe Dr. Yayan may edit what I might say, please.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Dr. Yayan, please.
Thank you, Excellency, and thank you, Dr. Milan. Ibu Ivana, I'm so pleased to meet someone who as well graduated from Sydney. I am an alumni of Sydney, but not from University of Sydney, but as an Indonesian Consul General based in Sydney. So glad to see you here. If you look at the snapshot between 1955 and 1961, there has been a number of historical studies done by scholars, both in the Western countries or Eastern European countries, and of course, some in Asian countries that include what I mean with Asian, like Japan or Indonesia, and of course in Australia as well. If we look at some findings, probably I think this is as Dr. Marco said, that there has been really an enthusiasm among scholars to look deeper and to collect more evidence or more historical records, to retrieve more historical records, to understand bit by bit the snapshots of Dr. Marco made a reference to the 1929 origins of the thoughts of the movement. This is quite interesting, the embryonic ideas of being non-aligned, and that according to some studies that it originated in 1929. Again, from my limited reading, both in Sydney, of course, and when I was as a graduate student in the United States, there has been certain interpretations among Western scholars that Indonesia had exposed a wait and see attitude. But again, if we look at some documents that we had, at least here in Indonesia, at least in the National Archives, for example, the wait and see snapshot had been so dynamic, both from the national perspective as well as from the global perspective, especially that time Indonesia under President Sukarno, that projected the independent and active foreign policy by placing the activisms as the vehicle. And there had been a thought that time that ideation wouldn't be possible without vehicle, without material, without corporeal forum. So in that thought, Indonesia, of course, under President Sukarno, so the critical importance of what an idea of a movement that embodied not only the NAM principle, but also the Bandung principles that as well overlap, as Dr. Marco said, also overlap with the principle enshrined within the UN Charter. So this is, I would rather saying that this is rather a dynamic and responsive wait and see period for Indonesia between 1955 and 1961. But I would suggest that perhaps we could do more studies on this part of the period. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mulyana, and thank you for this great point. This might be a guideline for future researchers of the non-aligned movement. So, Marco, would you like to just briefly answer the question?
Yeah, yes. Ivana, thank you for actually raising this idea about the possibility to have a center for Indonesian studies. Maybe it can be interesting for us here to mention that there is the Center for Asian Studies at the Faculty of Political Science. But here with us today is our Vice Dean, Professor Nemanja Džuverović, who is in charge of the scientific cooperation. And in that manner, maybe he could have some additional words on what would be the viability of having various research centers established at the faculty in the forthcoming period.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this introduction, since Professor Džuverović was the next one who actually raised the hand for asking a question. So, Professor Džuverović, Vice Dean of the Faculty of Political Science, the floor is yours, please. Yeah.
Well, that's an interesting point. I'm sure that we can decide afterwards the issue of studies. But I wanted to ask one question, and maybe to give one anecdote for the end. This morning, when I was taking a 7-year-old to the school, she saw all these flags in our streets. So I had to give her a crash 15-minute course about non-aligned movement while these flags are there, and she seems particularly interested. So I think youth is also very interested in non-aligned movement, which can be only a good thing. But my question would be probably directed to Marco, but others can also reflect. I mean, because of concerns in Yugoslavia and in our field, in our field of international relations, there are now this rediscovering of non-aligned movement, but also very critical reflection of Yugoslavia role. Yugoslavia somehow has double agenda, maybe that's too hard word, but you probably know what I'm referring to. It kind of used now for its foreign policy goals. So just wondering, would you agree with this critical reflection of the Yugoslavian role, or do you think Yugoslavia participates with genuine interest in developing post-colonial developments? So just kind of brief reflection on that. Then, of course, if we are, someone else would like to reflect that from the Indonesian side, then we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Djuverovic. Dr.
Thank you.
Kovačević, yes.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you, Professor Djuverovic. When it comes to Yugoslavia's role, I think it has to be differentiated if we look at different periods from, let's say, roughly about 40 years of Yugoslavia's policy of active, peaceful coexistence. I think we have to mention that particular notion here, because when thinking about non-alignment, about non-aligned movement, there was this nascent period of Yugoslav foreign policy after 1948, after the split with Stalin and moving away from the Soviet-dominated bloc. And actually, 1950s were a very interesting period when Yugoslavia, around that time, actually was seeking ways to establish contacts with the countries of the Third World, what will become known as the Third World later, or even Global South afterwards. So in that sense, Yugoslavia had its orientation towards finding a new policy, which was based on this outreach toward the Third World and other countries outside of Europe. So it was kind of, symbolically speaking, leaving Europe, and when having this encounter and meetings with the non-aligned, later what will become non-aligned movement, and liberated countries from the colonial period, and then of countries, newly emerging countries. Actually, Yugoslavia was at first in these diplomatic encounters. I can speak about diplomatic encounters. Yugoslavia was seeking ways to discuss various important political problems and cooperation within the United Nations system. That's what I have done my research about. And some of the first contacts were actually established in 1949 and 1950, when Yugoslavia was functioning within the UN General Assembly and within the United Nations Security Council as a non-permanent member in its mandate in 1950, 1951. And especially there were important ties established with India, for example, around that time. And Yugoslav diplomats after 1949 were and Yugoslav ambassadors were very much prominent, especially ambassadors to India, ambassadors, for example, Aleš Bebler, who was member of the UN representation of Serbia mission in New York, and so on. And in that sense, I can say, if we would look this historical time, there was the mixture of certain necessity, ideas, and interest. And if we would like to delineate on the importance, on the relative importance of these factors in each historical period, in each decade, in 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, there was the different relative weight of these elements in what Yugoslavia actually was seeking in the non-aligned movement. So I would say then that, and there are even, I think, certain structural preconditions that could be used here, for example, because Yugoslavia was the only European, and if we would like to use certain terms which would subscribe to the notions of race, class, gender, and different critical notions that are used in today's theory. It was the only, let's say, called white country that was part of the non-aligned movement. But it was not the ordinary, let's say, so-called, let's say, country that it wasn't using any racial elements in its foreign policy. I think there has been a lot of research, and there was even one doctoral dissertation defended at the University of Belgrade in 2020, I think, on the Department of History, which actually reflected on the notions of how the Yugoslavs were perceived in the non-aligned countries. And these representations of the Yugoslavs in the non-aligned countries were usually through the notions of diplomats, engineers, doctors, physicians, basically, and certain friendly encounters that were actually established through the exchange of students from the non-aligned countries with the Yugoslav, for example, colleagues and so on. And for example, there is this interesting notion of how the non-aligned country of Ethiopia, for example, it was one of the first countries that established these cordial and functioning bilateral relations with Yugoslavia, when, for example, Yugoslav doctors and physicians actually went to Ethiopia to work there and to gain certain working experience and to help the establishment of the more functioning health system in Ethiopia, for example. That is one episode from the early 50s, from the 1952, for example, 1953. And in that sense, that cooperation further developed. But my estimate would be that the perception of Yugoslavia in the non-aligned world was mostly positive, and it was positive because, and then we have the subsequent decades of the 1960s, 1970s, and 1980s. So Yugoslavia in the and I will probably take another minute or two to complete my answer. It's a very complex one. It used actually this opportunity in the non-aligned movement maybe to try to help certain countries, but also it had some reasons for that. For example, Yugoslavia had a functioning diplomacy in the 1950s and early 1960s, whereas the non-aligned and newly independent countries actually didn't have sufficiently strong diplomatic apparatus, for example. That was one clear reason, for example, why Yugoslavia was able to take on this diplomatic role, for example, to play this pivotal role in the non-aligned movement between 1961 and 1970. And then in Lusaka, at the Lusaka conference, the situation got different because non-aligned movement became fully institutionalized from Lusaka conference onwards. And then in 1974, we have this coordinating bureau of the non-aligned movement, for example, which gave the real force to the non-aligned movement. But then if we would like to reflect on the whole period of these 40 years for Yugoslavia, I think in the first period in the 1950s, there was probably greater domination of interest, in diplomatic interest to distance Yugoslavia from the Soviet bloc. But then, what is very important is that Yugoslavia had one key ideational factor that brought it together and actually enabled it to cooperate with the non-aligned countries. And that was its legacy of the anti-fascism and fighting fascism in the 1940s in the Second World War. So Tito was very, very able to have this ideational component to try to get this greater bonding with the non-aligned countries which had their anti-colonial struggle. So there was this very good combination between anti-fascism and anti-colonialism that enabled this early bonding of the Yugoslavian and non-aligned partners. So when we come to the 2000s and this more recent period, there is of course this benefit of hindsight of to look upon the period of the 40 years of Yugoslavia's role in non-aligned movement. And then there are new critical theories. We have to question certain notions. We can approach this from the notion of diplomatic history. That is probably one possibility. We have social histories, which are probably something which opens up new space for research today. And what is actually this idea of media representation, how societies cooperated, what were the experiences of students and their experiences in Yugoslavia and vice versa, and so on. But still, to wrap up this, my impression would be that non-aligned movement and Yugoslavia's role was mostly positive. It was bounded by the context of the Cold War, but then I think that this ideational role played a significant part even in the 1970s and 1980s.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kovačević. And unfortunately, we are running out of time, but I will use the opportunity as a moderator to, instead of having my own conclusion and something like a wrap up of this discussion, I will use these 5 minutes assigned to me to ask respected Dr. Muljana and His Excellency Ambassador Nurbin Toro, just to briefly share with us their views of the future of the movement. So, Dr. Muljana, what is your view of the future of the NAM, please?
Thank you. Probably His Excellency might start, and I will follow up from what
All right.
is,
Yes, Your Excellency, please.
Okay. Thank you. Actually, as a non-CSSTC was the part of non-aligned movement, I would like to share in this discussion that please non-aligned movement is a, let's say, is a grouping for certain countries, but by doing what, let's say, what I've done a few days yesterday and last today, and also what have we done non-CSSTC, please see that non-aligned movement is a positive movement. We can do anything for a good future of the member countries. This is my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. So hopefully the member countries and also observer countries as Serbia will benefit from the movement in the future. And Dr. Muljana, would you like to add something, please?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Marco, in his presentations earlier, said that the non-aligned movement emerged from a complex global context. And today, the non-aligned movement is living, operating, and functioning within a much greater complex that has more determinants within the movement as well as outside the movement. And within that context, I think we have to, if we look at the futures of the NAM, the questions of its pertinence as part of the global community, as we are facing strategic challenges, probably what we have to do is to think outside the box in devising strategic responses to these strategic challenges. The world today has been marked by competition and rivalry. Of course, we are still witnessing cooperation and global collaborations, but again, among strategic powers, the situation, at least in our regions, in Indo-Pacific regions, for example, the dynamic has been marked by the return of power politics. And what scholars say is the Thucydides trap that would probably these rivalry and competitions rather than cooperation would lead to a worse scenario if we together, the international community that include the non-aligned movement, do not respond rightly to the situation. And leadership of the non-alignment movement entails providing right responses and prompt responses to the situation that include protracted new and renewed conflicts within and outside the non-aligned movement, and of course the existential challenges which include the pandemic and climate change. And at least there are 6 points as probably the non-alignment and needs to reflect on. First, to diversify the leadership with 120 members of the movement, probably at least 1 or 2 that would come up with bold leadership in galvanizing, taking into account differences within the movement, to have unity of voice responding to these strategic challenges. And the second one is showing greater feasibility in solving global problems. That's probably would make our movement pertinent and generate as many deliverables as possible in the areas of peace and security, as well as in the areas of development and economic cooperation, and enhance the commitment depth. This is probably an area for research, especially students of political science or students of international relations, if they are interested in writing the level or the level of the commitment depth of 120 member of the movement and 17 observers, and we can have an index and we develop the scales and see in what ways that we can transform this into policies within the non-aligned movement. And of course, as well, critical to be having unity of voice and unity of action, and increasing the level of multi-stakeholders, internal support and participation. His Excellency Ambassador of Egypt mentions the dynamics of the level, the absolute level, or the levels that involve working diplomatic efforts, and that's why I also welcome the creations of the non-aligned movement youth network. Probably we need more to advance the internal support and participations that would as well add to the level of the stakeholders supports to the non-aligned movement. And as I said earlier, that we are having the paradox of size with 120 members, and this huge size could be a challenge, could be a potential. Probably we need to look further in what ways that we can capitalize this huge size into a strong force of global cooperations and moral force for peace and security and progress for all nations. And here again, the visibility of non-aligned movement can once again be seen as what we witnessed in 1960s and in 1970s. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Muliana. Unfortunately, we are at the end of our today's discussion. And before we finish, I would firstly like to thank to our panelists for their great speeches. It was great pleasure to talk with them today. And I know that both me and you have plenty of questions which are still unanswered. Unfortunately, we had only an hour and 15 minutes for this discussion, but I would just like to emphasize that all of the questions which were asked in the chat option will be answered, but later in different methods, in different ways. So basically, we have written your questions and they will be answered. Don't worry about that. Besides that, I would like to thank to the Embassy of the Republic of Indonesia for organizing this event together with University of Belgrade. And I hope that we will cooperate even more in the future. I think that we have two great examples of how Indonesia and Serbia should be connected here at our session today. Ivana Prazic, a Serbian student who speaks at least a bit of Indonesian, and Fabia Kaputri, who speaks Serbian, and she was a brilliant student at my university. So basically, I sincerely hope that in the future we will have more people-to-people connections and more cooperation on institutional and people level, and that is one of the goals for all of us to fulfill in the next decade. Thank you very much. Thanks to all of the followers and participants who followed us online, and I hope to see you soon again on the similar event. Thank you very much.